Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. It was supposed to be a routine trip. New York to Chicago. Overnight sleeper car. I had a book, earbuds, and a packed dinner from the deli near Penn Station. The plan was simple. Sleep through Ohio, wake up in Illinois, grab coffee at Union Station. But somewhere past Cleveland, everything changed. My name's Mick, and I need to tell you what happened on that train. Not because I want to relive it, but because people need to know. The news won't cover this. Too many questions, too few answers. But I was there. I survived the first 12 hours when the world started eating itself alive. The 6:47 p.m. departure from New York was running on time for once. I'd booked a roomette in the sleeper car. Nothing fancy, just a narrow bunk and a fold-down sink. The whole car had that stale, recycled air smell mixed with industrial carpet cleaner and the faint odor of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying mustiness of old upholstery. 26 passengers in our section. Mostly business travelers and a few retirees heading to see family. The sleeping car attendant, a cheerful guy named Rodriguez, had made his rounds explaining meal times and wake-up calls. Everything felt normal, routine. My compartment was across from a woman who looked to be in her early 30s. Auburn hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, designer glasses perched on her nose, wearing an expensive-looking blazer that screamed corporate lawyer or investment banker. She had the kind of sharp, angular beauty that intimidated most men and probably knew it. When I'd tried to make polite conversation during boarding, she'd given me a look that could freeze hell over and turned back to her hardcover book, some thick tome about international finance. The message was clear: don't bother me. So I didn't. But I noticed things. The way she read without moving her lips, turning pages with precise, efficient movements. How she'd ordered her meal from Rodriguez with the same cold professionalism she probably used in boardroom meetings. Even the way she organized her small space, laptop precisely aligned on the fold-down table, phone charger coiled in perfect loops, not a single item out of place. Control freak, I'd thought. Probably the type who color codes her calendar and has never been 5 minutes late to anything in her life. I remember settling into the dining car around 7:30, grabbing a beer and turkey sandwich. The observation windows offered a perfect view of Pennsylvania countryside, rolling past in golden evening light. A college kid at the next table was video chatting with someone, laughing about missing a midterm for this trip. Behind him, an elderly couple shared a piece of cheesecake, the woman feeding bites to her husband with the tenderness of 60 years together. A businessman in an expensive suit complained loudly into his phone about delayed contracts while cutting his steak with aggressive precision. His voice carried that particular brand of East Coast arrogance that made everyone within earshot want to throw something at him. The whole scene felt wonderfully normal, predictable, safe. I spent about an hour in the dining car, nursing my beer and watching the landscape fade from gold to deep purple. Other passengers filtered in and out. The corporate woman from across my compartment appeared briefly, ordered a salad and white wine, then disappeared back to her sanctuary without making eye contact with anyone. By 10 p.m. I was back in my roomette, trying to read a paperback thriller I'd grabbed at Penn Station. The narrow space felt cozy rather than cramped, with just enough room to stretch out on the lower bunk. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks created a hypnotic background that should have put me to sleep within minutes. But sleep wouldn't come. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The air circulation system hummed differently than before, more labored, as if struggling against some obstruction. Outside my window, the darkness seemed more complete, absent of the usual scattered farmhouse lights that dotted rural Ohio. The first real sign something was wrong came around 11:30 p.m., somewhere between Cleveland and Toledo. I was still awake, staring at the same page of my book for the 5th time, when the train lurched to a sudden stop. Not the gradual slowing you expect at a station, a jarring, emergency brake kind of stop that sent my book flying across the narrow space and slammed me against the wall. My water bottle rolled off the fold-down table and clattered to the floor. The sudden silence that followed was deeply unsettling. Train engines never really stop making noise. There's always the hum of generators, the whisper of air brakes, the subtle vibrations of a massive machine at rest. But this felt different. Dead quiet, except for the settling groans of cooling metal and confused murmurs from other passengers. I pressed my face to the window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light. Nothing but darkness outside. No station lights, no platform, not even the glow of a distant highway. Just empty countryside stretching into blackness that seemed to swallow everything. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. No announcement from the crew, no explanation over the intercom system. Just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl and sent primitive warning signals racing through my nervous system. I could hear people moving in the corridor outside my door. Compartment doors opening with their distinctive mechanical clicks. Concerned voices asking the same questions I was thinking. Why had we stopped? Where were we? What was taking so long? That's when I heard it. A commotion from the direction of the dining car, several cars forward from our sleeper section. Not the usual chatter of passengers or the clink of dishes being cleared. Something urgent. Frightened. The sound carried through the ventilation system, muffled but unmistakably wrong. I stepped into the corridor, joining other passengers who were peering out of their compartments with confused expressions. The corporate woman emerged from her roomette across from mine, no longer perfectly composed. Her ponytail had come loose, auburn hair falling around her shoulders, and her designer glasses reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Any idea what's happening?" she asked, her previous coldness replaced by genuine concern. Her voice carried a slight southern accent that she'd probably spent years trying to suppress. "No clue," I replied. "Been stopped for about 10 minutes now. No announcements." She checked her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to constant communication. "No signal," she muttered, then looked up at me with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Victoria, by the way. Sorry for being unfriendly earlier. Long day. Mick, and don't worry about it." Before I could say more, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steady again, but dimmer somehow. The overhead fluorescence cast everything in a sickly yellow glow that made everyone's faces look hollow and drawn. The sounds from the dining car were getting louder, clearer. Not just voices now, crashes like furniture being overturned, glass breaking with sharp, violent sounds that echoed through the connecting passages. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't identify at first. Low, guttural, almost animal-like. A conductor appeared at the far end of our car, moving fast. Too fast for someone trying to maintain professional composure. His uniform was disheveled, his hat missing, and even from 50 feet away I could see dark stains across his white shirt. He wasn't walking normally. He was stumbling, almost falling, catching himself against the walls as he moved with desperate, panicked urgency. "Sir," Victoria called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in boardrooms. "What's happening? Why have we stopped?" He looked up at the sound of her voice, and that's when I saw his face clearly. Pale as newspaper, eyes wide with something beyond fear. Pure animal terror. His mouth moved like he was trying to speak, but only a strangled, choking sound came out. Spittle ran down his chin, mixed with something darker. Blood. That's what the dark stains were. Fresh blood spreading across his shirt in arterial spurts, dripping from a ragged wound on his neck that looked like bite marks, deep tearing wounds that went down to the muscle. He turned and ran, abandoning all pretense of professional behavior, pushing past concerned passengers and leaving bloody handprints on the walls as he fled toward the rear of the train. His footsteps pounded against the metal floor with increasing desperation, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely into the darkness beyond our car. The corridor erupted in nervous chatter. A businessman 2 doors down tried calling 911 on his phone. No signal. An elderly woman clutched her husband's arm, whispering frantically about getting off the train. A young mother emerged from her compartment clutching a sleeping toddler, her eyes darting between the other passengers, as if looking for reassurance that none of us could provide. An older man in a veteran's cap started moving toward the dining car, muttering about taking charge of the situation and finding out what was really going on. His jaw was set with military determination, the kind that had probably served him well in Korea or Vietnam. I should have stopped him, should have grabbed his arm and told him to wait, to think this through. But I was frozen, trying to process what I'd just seen. A conductor covered in blood, running like his life depended on it, leaving a trail of crimson evidence that something horrible was happening just a few cars away. The pieces didn't fit together into anything that made sense. Victoria moved closer to me, her earlier coldness completely gone. "That was blood," she said quietly, stating the obvious because sometimes stating the obvious is the only way to make your mind accept reality. "A lot of blood." "Yeah," I agreed, watching the veteran disappear around the corner toward the dining car. "Question is, whose blood was it?" The screaming started about 5 minutes later, high-pitched, desperate, primal sounds of terror that no human throat should ever have to make, coming from somewhere forward in the train, in the direction the veteran had gone. Not one voice, multiple voices overlapping, creating a chorus of agony that made my blood turn to ice and sent every evolutionary alarm in my brain into overdrive. The businessman who'd headed toward the dining car was nowhere to be seen. Neither was the veteran. "We need to get off this train," Victoria whispered beside me, her financial expertise utterly useless in the face of whatever was happening. Her hands were shaking as she clutched her phone, trying again and again to get a signal that wouldn't come. But we couldn't get off. We were locked in a steel tube in the middle of nowhere, with no way to contact the outside world, and something horrific happening just a few cars away. The windows were designed not to open, safety feature that had suddenly become a death trap. The lights flickered again. This time they stayed dim, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own, as air currents from the ventilation system stirred loose papers and debris. The air conditioning hummed erratically, spreading whatever sounds were coming from the dining car throughout the entire train like some kind of nightmare broadcasting system. More screaming. Closer now. And underneath it, that guttural sound I'd heard before. Not human, not animal. Something in between that triggered deep ancestral fears about things that hunt in the darkness. A woman came running down the corridor from the direction of the dining car, her footsteps pounding against metal with irregular, stumbling rhythm. Middle-aged, wearing a blood-splattered Penn State sweatshirt that had probably been clean and cheerful an hour ago. Her eyes were wild and she moved with a strange gait that reminded me of someone severely drunk or suffering from a massive head injury. But this wasn't intoxication or concussion. As she got closer, I could see the wound on her arm. A perfect semicircle of puncture marks like a bite from something with very large, very sharp teeth. Deep enough that white bone showed through the torn flesh, and blood streamed down her fingers in steady rivulets, leaving a trail of red droplets on the industrial carpet. "Help!" she gasped, reaching toward us with her uninjured hand, fingers grasping at empty air with desperate need. "Please, they're eating... Oh God, they're eating people." She never finished the sentence. Her eyes rolled back, showing only bloodshot white, and she collapsed face first onto the metal floor. The impact made a wet, horrible sound that I'll never forget, like a watermelon dropped from a great height. Victoria screamed, a sharp sound of pure horror that she immediately tried to muffle with her hands. Other passengers backed away, pressing themselves against their compartment doors, their faces masks of disbelief and growing terror. The woman on the floor wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, just lying there in a spreading pool of her own blood that reflected the flickering fluorescent lights. Then she twitched. Not the natural spasms of death, something deliberate. Her fingers curled into claws, scratching against the metal floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Her head turned toward us, even though her eyes remained white and sightless, as if she could sense our presence through some other means. When she stood up, she moved wrong, joints bending at angles that made my stomach lurch and bile rise in my throat. Her jaw hung open, revealing teeth stained dark with blood, not just her own blood. I realized with growing horror, and the sound she made, a wet, rattling moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, like air being forced through damaged vocal cords. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with an accident or a medical emergency or some kind of terrorist attack. This was something else entirely. Something that turned people into predators, into things that attacked and fed on other human beings. The thing that had been a woman lurched toward Victoria, arms outstretched, fingers clawing at the air. I didn't think, just reacted on pure instinct. Grabbed Victoria's arm and pulled her into my compartment, slamming the door behind us and engaging the flimsy lock with shaking hands. The thin metal barrier felt pathetically inadequate as something heavy crashed against it from the outside, rattling the entire frame. Victoria was hyperventilating, her perfect composure completely shattered. She pressed herself against the far wall of the narrow space, staring at the door with wide, terrified eyes. Outside, we could hear the thing that had been a passenger clawing at the metal, leaving scratches that would probably be visible when morning came. If morning ever came. "What's happening?" Victoria whispered, her southern accent stronger now that her careful control had cracked. "What's wrong with them? People don't just come back from the dead and start attacking others." I didn't have an answer. Couldn't have one. This was beyond my experience, beyond anything that should have been possible in the real world. People didn't just reanimate after death and start hunting the living. That was horror movie stuff, not reality. But the sounds outside the door were very real. The wet slapping of bare feet against metal as more figures moved through the corridor, the scraping of fingernails against walls, leaving gouges in the paint, and underneath it all a growing chorus of moaning voices that sent primal fear racing through my nervous system and made every muscle in my body tense for fight or flight. My phone had no signal, but the clock still worked. 12:47 a.m. Less than 2 hours since we'd stopped, and everything had gone to hell. I tried to remember what the conductor had looked like when he ran past us. The absolute terror in his eyes suggested he'd seen something that broke his understanding of the world. Now I was seeing it too. Through the small window in my compartment door, I caught glimpses of movement in the corridor. Figures shambling past with erratic but determined movements, their clothes torn and blood-soaked. Some wore passenger outfits I recognized, the businessman's expensive suit now ripped and stained. Others were in Amtrak uniforms, their professional appearance grotesquely twisted into something nightmarish. They moved drawn by sounds or smells I couldn't identify. When one heard Victoria's muffled sobs, it would turn toward our door and begin clawing at the metal, leaving bloody streaks across the surface before moving on to investigate other sounds. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to Victoria, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. "Find other survivors. Get to the engine car. Maybe the engineer can tell us what's happening." She nodded frantically, tears streaming down her cheeks and destroying what remained of her perfect makeup. "There have to be others," she whispered back. "Other people who aren't." She couldn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant. Other people who hadn't been turned into whatever those things in the corridor had become. I checked the emergency procedures posted beside the door, looking for any information that might help. In case of emergency, passengers should remain calm and await instructions from crew members, follow evacuation procedures as directed by authorized personnel, report any suspicious activity to the nearest conductor. Fat lot of good that did when the crew members were trying to eat us, and the authorized personnel had either fled or been turned into monsters. The train shuddered slightly, as if something heavy had moved through the cars ahead of us. Then silence again. Not the absence of sound, but something worse. The quiet that comes before disaster strikes, when predators pause to listen for prey. Victoria grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone who probably spent most of her time behind a desk. "Listen," she whispered urgently. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first, nothing but the mechanical sounds of the train's systems and the distant moaning of the infected in other parts of the car. Then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of voices. Human voices. Speaking in urgent whispers, coming from somewhere toward the rear of the train. Other survivors, they had to be. The question was, how do we reach them when the corridors are full of things that used to be people, things that now saw us as nothing more than food? The voices were getting clearer. 3 distinct speakers, maybe 4, whispering urgently in what sounded like the observation car at the rear of the train. They were alive, uninfected, and probably just as terrified as we were. "We have to try," I told Victoria, checking my watch. 1:23 a.m. We'd been trapped in this nightmare for almost 2 hours, and it was only getting worse. Those people back there might know something we don't. Maybe they found a way to communicate with the outside world. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara but regaining some of her composure. What about those things in the corridor? I pressed my ear to the door again, listening to the sounds outside. The moaning had decreased slightly, but I could still hear movement, shuffling footsteps, the occasional scrape of fingernails against metal. They were still out there, still hunting. "The service corridor," I said, remembering the train's layout from previous trips. "Between the wall and the main passenger area. It's narrow, probably not wide enough for them to move through easily. If we can get to it?" "That's a big if," Victoria pointed out, but she was already moving, gathering her essentials into a small purse. Gone was the cold corporate facade. Survival had stripped away her professional armor, revealing someone who could think clearly under pressure. I grabbed my backpack, checking the contents: water bottle, energy bars, a small flashlight, and a paperback book that now seemed absurdly trivial. Not much in the way of weapons, but better than nothing. The service corridor access was 2 doors down from my compartment. I'd noticed it earlier when exploring the car, a narrow maintenance passage that ran parallel to the main corridor, used by crew members to service electrical and plumbing systems without disturbing passengers. "On 3, I whispered to Victoria, my hand on the door handle. "Move fast, stay quiet, and whatever happens, don't look back." She nodded, gripping her purse like a lifeline. I could see the fear in her green eyes, but also determination. Whatever her background, Victoria wasn't the type to give up easily. I turned the handle slowly, wincing at every small sound. The door opened with a soft click that seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting everything in hellish red shadows. To our left, 3 of the infected stood swaying near the far end of the car. They hadn't noticed us yet, too focused on something in the adjoining car. To our right, the service corridor door was partially hidden behind a decorative panel. We moved like ghosts, feet barely touching the carpet. Victoria stayed close behind me, her breathing carefully controlled. The service door was unlocked, a small mercy in this nightmare. I eased it open just wide enough for us to slip through. The service corridor was even narrower than I'd remembered, barely wide enough for one person, with pipes and electrical conduits running along the walls at head height. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of machine oil and recycled air. But it was quiet. The infected hadn't discovered this space yet. We moved through the darkness, guided by the faint glow of my flashlight held low to avoid casting shadows. Behind us, I could hear the main corridor growing more active. More footsteps, more moaning. The infection was spreading through the train like wildfire. The service corridor connected to multiple cars running almost the entire length of the train. We passed junction points where we could hear activity in the adjacent passenger areas, sometimes the shuffle of infected feet, other times the terrified whispers of survivors hiding in their compartments. At one point, we heard children crying in a nearby family compartment. Victoria stopped, her hand reaching toward the access panel. I caught her wrist, shaking my head. Opening that panel would expose the family to the infected in the main corridor. We couldn't save them without dooming them. The guilt of that decision still eats at me. We pressed on, following the corridor toward the rear of the train. The voices were getting clearer now, definitely survivors, and they were arguing about something in hushed, urgent tones. "The radio's dead," someone was saying. "Has been for the past hour. Whatever's jamming our communications is getting stronger." "Then we use the emergency beacon," another voice replied. "Manual activation. It'll bring help." "What help?" A third voice, older and more gravelly. You think the authorities are equipped to deal with this? Hell, you think they even know what this is? We reached the access panel leading to the observation car. Through the thin metal, I could make out 4 distinct voices now. 2 men, 2 women, all adults. I knocked softly. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. A simple pattern that said human rather than mindless infected. Silence on the other side. Then footsteps approaching cautiously. Who's there? A woman's voice, strained but controlled. Survivors from the sleeper car, I whispered back. We heard voices. Can you let us in? More whispered conversation than the sound of furniture being moved. The panel opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes. She wore a conductor's uniform, the badge identifying her as Janet Mills, assistant manager. Get in here quickly, she said, helping us through the narrow opening, before they hear us. The observation car had been converted into a makeshift command center. The large windows were covered with blankets and seat cushions, blocking any view of the outside while muffling sound. 4 people huddled around a table covered with maps, radio equipment, and emergency supplies. Janet made the introductions quickly. Besides herself, there was Frank, the head conductor, a bear of a man with 20 years of railroad experience. Maria, a young paramedic who'd been deadheading back to Chicago after a conference. And Dr. Patterson, a retired physician traveling to visit his daughter. How many others are there? Victoria asked immediately. How many survivors? Frank's expression was grim. As far as we know, maybe a dozen spread throughout the train. But it's hard to tell. The infection spreads fast, and once they turn... He shook his head. We've lost contact with the engine crew about an hour ago. The engineer? I asked. What happened to him? Tom Bradley, 30-year veteran, Janet replied. Last transmission we got, he was reporting electrical problems and trying to restart the engine. Then nothing but static. Dr. Patterson looked up from examining a handheld radio. The infection appears to be spread through bites, he said in the clinical tone of someone trying to maintain scientific objectivity in the face of horror. Transmission is rapid, with symptoms appearing within minutes. Once the host expires, reanimation occurs almost immediately. Reanimation, Victoria repeated flatly. You're talking about zombies. The word hung in the air like a curse. None of us wanted to say it, but there it was, the impossible made real. Call them whatever you want, Maria said. She was young, maybe 25, but her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much death. I've treated bite victims before, animal attacks usually. This is different. The tissue damage is massive, but it's the neurological effects that are... She trailed off, shaking her head. We need to get to the engine, I said. Try to restart the train, get moving toward the next station. Frank barked a bitter laugh. Son, even if we could restart this beast, where exactly do you think we'd go? You think the next station is going to be any safer? This thing, whatever it is, it didn't start on our train. We're just the unlucky ones who got caught in the middle of it. As if to punctuate his point, a distant explosion lit up the night sky through gaps in the covered windows. Orange light flickered against the glass, followed by the low rumble of something burning in the distance. Cleveland's burning, Janet said quietly. Has been for the past hour. Whatever's happening here, it's happening everywhere. The radio crackled with static. Then a faint voice broke through. Emergency broadcast. Remain in your homes. Military personnel are authorized to deadly force. Then nothing but white noise. Dr. Patterson adjusted the frequency, searching for any other signals. I've been monitoring emergency channels for the past 2 hours, he said. What little I can pick up suggests widespread civil unrest, infrastructure failures, communications blackouts. Zombie apocalypse, Victoria said with dark humor. I always figured it would be nuclear war or climate change that got us. Not this. A sudden impact against the observation car's main door made us all freeze. Something was outside, pressing against the metal. We could hear the wet sound of hands slapping against the surface, leaving what were probably bloody prints. They're drawn to sound, Maria whispered. And warmth. Body heat shows up differently than the ambient temperature. The sounds outside grew more intense. More hands joining the first, a chorus of moaning that seemed to vibrate through the metal walls. Whatever had found us was calling to others. "We need to move," Frank said, grabbing the radio equipment. "This position is compromised." "Move where?" I asked. "The whole train is crawling with those things." "The baggage car," Janet replied. "Rear of the train, reinforced doors, minimal windows. We can barricade ourselves in there while we figure out our next move." The plan was simple in theory. The baggage car was only 2 cars behind us, connected by the narrow vestibules between cars. In practice, it meant crossing open areas where the infected could see us, hear us, surround us. Frank took point, carrying a fire axe he'd retrieved from an emergency station. Maria followed with the medical supplies. Dr. Patterson carried the radio. Victoria and I brought up the rear, trying to watch for threats from behind. The vestibule between cars was a nightmare of metal and shadows. The flexible connection swayed and creaked with every movement, and the space was barely wide enough for one person. Worse, the connecting doors had windows, large enough for the infected to see us coming. We made it through the first car without incident. The passenger compartments were mostly empty. Their occupants either fled or turned, but the corridors showed signs of struggle. Overturned luggage, blood smears on the walls, abandoned personal items scattered across the floor. The second vestibule was where everything went wrong. Frank was halfway across when an infected conductor appeared at the far end. The thing had been Tom Bradley, the engineer. I recognized him from his employee photo on the wall, but recognition meant nothing to what he'd become. His engineer's overalls were torn and blood-soaked, his face a mask of mindless hunger. Frank swung the fire axe, connecting with Bradley's shoulder. The impact would have dropped any living person, but Bradley barely staggered. He grabbed Frank's arm, his jaw opening to reveal blood-stained teeth. I pushed past the others, grabbing Frank's other arm and pulling hard. The 3 of us crashed into the vestibule wall, a tangle of arms and legs. Bradley's teeth snapped inches from Frank's throat. Victoria solved the problem by bringing her heavy purse down on Bradley's skull with surprising force. The leather bag contained her laptop, and 20 pounds of metal and electronics made an effective club. Bradley's head snapped to the side, and he collapsed onto the metal flooring. "Is he dead?" Maria asked, breathing hard. Dr. Patterson knelt beside the body, checking for vital signs. "His skull is fractured, severe brain trauma, but with these things..." He produced a small knife from his medical kit and drove it into Bradley's temple. Better safe than sorry. We reached the baggage car without further incident, though we could hear more infected moving through the train behind us. Frank used his master key to open the reinforced door, and we quickly moved inside. The baggage car was a cavern of shadows and stacked luggage. Rows of suitcases, boxes, and cargo containers created a maze of hiding spots. More importantly, the car had only 2 entrances, both with heavy doors that could be secured from the inside. "This will hold them for a while," Frank said, engaging multiple locks on the main door. "But not forever. These cars weren't designed to keep people out." We set up a defensive position near the center of the car, using luggage to create barriers and sight lines. Janet distributed supplies from her emergency kit: water, energy bars, first aid materials. Not much, but enough to keep us going for a few hours. "So what's the plan?" Victoria asked. "We can't stay here indefinitely." Frank checked his watch. "Next station is Toledo, about 30 miles east. If we could get the engine restarted." "Without an engineer?" I pointed out. "Do any of us know how to operate a locomotive?" Silence answered that question. Dr. Patterson looked up from the radio, his face grave. "I'm picking up emergency broadcasts from Toledo. The city is under quarantine. Military roadblocks. Shoot on-site orders for anyone trying to leave the containment zone." "So much for our next station," Maria said bitterly. Outside, we could hear the infected gathering, the sound of bodies pressing against the car's walls, fingernails scraping against metal. They knew we were here, but couldn't figure out how to reach us. Yet. "There has to be something we can do," Victoria insisted. "Some way to contact the outside world. Call for help." "Help from who?" Frank asked. "Sounds like the outside world has its own problems right now." That's when we felt it. A subtle vibration through the train's frame, different from the random movements of the infected. "Engines starting up," Frank said, his face showing the first hope I'd seen all night. "Someone's in the locomotive." The vibration grew stronger. The sound of diesel engines warming up carried through the metal framework of the train. After hours of dead silence, the familiar rumble felt like salvation. "We need to get up there," I said. "Help whoever's trying to get us moving." Frank shook his head. "Son, there's half a dozen cars between us and the engine, all of them crawling with infected. It's suicide." But the alternative was staying trapped in the baggage car while our unknown savior tried to operate a locomotive alone. If they failed, if they got overwhelmed by infected, we'd be stuck here until we ran out of water or the doors finally gave way. The train lurched forward, just a few feet, then stopped. The engine was running, but something was wrong. We could hear the struggle from here, metal grinding against metal, the squeal of brakes being applied and released. "Whoever's up there doesn't know what they're doing," Frank said grimly. "They're going to burn out the engine or derail us." "Then we go help them," Victoria said, standing up and shouldering her purse. "All of us together." It was madness. 6 cars of infected passengers and crew stood between us and the locomotive. The corridors were narrow, the vestibules even narrower. We'd be exposed and vulnerable every step of the way. But it was also our only chance. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find. Frank had his fire axe. Dr. Patterson found a heavy wrench in the baggage car's toolkit. Maria grabbed a metal flashlight. Victoria kept her laptop-loaded purse. I picked up a crowbar that had probably been used to open cargo containers. "Stay together," Frank instructed as he unlocked the door leading toward the engine. "Move fast, hit hard, and don't stop for anything. Once we start this, there's no going back." The door opened onto a corridor full of shadows and the stench of death. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, our unknown savior was fighting to save us all. We stepped into hell, and the last phase of our nightmare began. The journey forward became a waking nightmare. Each car brought fresh horrors, passengers we'd shared dinner with now shambling through blood-soaked corridors. Their humanity stripped away. Frank's axe cut through them, but I could see the toll it was taking on all of us. Maria broke down completely in the third car, sobbing over the body of a child who'd been traveling with his grandmother. Dr. Patterson had to drag her away as more infected closed in from both directions. We lost Janet in the dining car. She slipped on spilled blood, went down hard, and 3 of them were on her before we could react. Her screams cut through everything else. Brief, terrible, then silence. Frank wanted to go back for her, but Victoria grabbed his arm, pulled him forward. We couldn't save the dead. By the time we reached the locomotive, we were down to 4 survivors. The engine compartment door was locked from the inside, and through the reinforced glass we could see our savior, a teenage kid, maybe 17, frantically working the controls with shaking hands. "Open up!" Frank pounded on the door. "We're here to help." The kid looked back at us with wild, terrified eyes. Blood streaked his face and his conductor's uniform was torn. A trainee, probably. He'd somehow made it to the engine when everything went to hell. But he didn't open the door, couldn't hear us over the engine noise, or maybe too panicked to think clearly. The locomotive was accelerating now, way too fast for the curves ahead. The speedometer showed 60 miles per hour and climbing. "Kid's gonna kill us all," Frank muttered, then started hammering on the glass with his axe handle. That's when I saw the real problem. Through the side windows, the landscape was blurring past at dangerous speed. But it wasn't just speed. The tracks ahead curved sharply to the right, following the Maumee River Valley. A curve rated for 30 miles per hour maximum. We were doing 80 now. "Get down," I shouted, grabbing Victoria and pulling her to the floor. "Everybody down!" The world exploded. Metal screamed against metal as the locomotive hit the curve at impossible speed. Physics took over. Tons of steel and momentum that couldn't be contained by curved rails. The engine tilted, caught air, and reality became a tumbling chaos of sparks and destruction. I remember the sensation of weightlessness as our car separated from the locomotive and flew through the darkness. The windows exploded inward, showering us with glass. Victoria's hand slipped from mine as we were thrown in different directions. Then impact. Crushing, bone-jarring impact that turned the world black. I came to lying in twisted metal and scattered luggage, my ears ringing, tasting blood. Dawn was breaking through the wreckage around me, pale light filtering through gaps in what had been the roof of our car. The smell of diesel fuel and smoke filled the air. My left arm hung useless, probably broken. Something warm was running down my face. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. I could hear moaning in the distance, but this was different. Human pain, not infected hunger. Other survivors, maybe, or maybe just the dying. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. Neither were Frank, Maria, or Dr. Patterson. The car had been torn apart, its contents scattered across a quarter-mile of Ohio countryside. Bodies lay twisted among the debris, some moving weakly, others still forever. I tried to call out, but my voice came as barely a whisper. My throat felt crushed and each breath sent daggers through my chest. Broken ribs at minimum, probably internal bleeding. In the growing daylight, I could see the full scope of the disaster. 7 cars derailed and scattered like a child's toys. The locomotive had rolled down an embankment and caught fire. Black smoke rose into the morning sky, a beacon that would surely draw attention. But attention from what? If Dr. Patterson had been right about the scope of the outbreak, rescue might not be coming anytime soon. I closed my eyes, fighting waves of pain and nausea. The sun felt warm on my face, and for a moment I could almost pretend this was just a bad dream. That I'd wake up in my narrow roomette, Victoria reading across the corridor, everything normal again. But when I opened my eyes, the wreckage was still there. And in the distance, shambling figures were already moving toward the crash site, drawn by the smoke and the scent of fresh blood. The infected had survived the crash too. I don't know how much time I have left. The pain is getting worse and I can hear them getting closer. Maybe rescue will come. Maybe someone will find this account and understand what happened here. Or maybe the world ended on a train between stations, and I'm just one of the last to realize it. The moaning is getting louder now. They've found the wreckage. I'm going to close my eyes and try to remember Victoria's laugh from earlier in the evening, back when laughter was still possible, back when the world made sense. It's a good memory to end on.